Alright, today we're going to talk about how to draw and label the coordinate plane. So, the first thing we should do is kind of talk about other ways that we might see the word coordinate plane labeled, or what we might see in a word problem if we come across it. We can see a couple of different things. You might see the x, y plane. Right? That's just a reference to the axes that we have in this. You might also see the Cartesian plane. I'll spell that out for you. This is just a fancy word for the coordinate plane, and what we're talking about is a graph that has an x and a y axis and has x and y coordinates on the graph. So any of these three different graphs can be a coordinate plane, or any of these other three words. They look different, but they all mean the same thing. This graph shows us an x and a y axis, which we'll talk about in a second, and then 4 different quadrants. This graph doesn't have an axis on them, but we could easily draw axes on. So I'm going to go ahead and use a really straight line, because we want our axes to be very straight. And I'm going to draw, two different lines to represent our axes. And now we've created a coordinate plane that has an x and a y axis. So let's talk about what a couple of these things mean. First of all, the x-axis. The x-axis is going to be our horizontal axis. Another way to think of that is the axis that travels from left to right. It travels from left to right. If I was going to draw this in a picture, I'm going to go ahead and draw out a coordinate plane that we see over here. The x-axis is our horizontal. It is the one that goes from left to right, right here. So I'm going to label this as x. One way I like to remember the horizontal axis, and I like to think of the horizon, because horizon and horizontal start with the same first couple letters. Horizontal, horizon. The horizon is the point where the sun is setting and it dips down to the curvature of the earth, and it almost looks like it's disappearing. We'll consider this the horizon. So think of that as the horizontal, or the x-axis. All right, the other axis we have is the y-axis. The y-axis is a vertical axis, or the axis that travels. Let me actually not reuse the word from. It travels from up and down. It travels up and down. So if I draw out my coordinate plane, the y-axis is this one right here. It travels up and down. So I'm going to go ahead and label on each of these graphs those two axes. I have an x here. It's my horizontal. I have a y here. It's my vertical line. I have an x-axis here. This is my horizontal line. I have a y-axis. This is my vertical. Now this one's a little bit tricky because we don't see this big graph like this with all 4 quadrants. But this is actually just like a zoomed in view of this corner of the graph right here. So we can still label this. My x-axis is my horizontal axis. I'm going to go ahead and put an x. And my y-axis is my vertical axis. So I'm going to put a y there. Alright, now that we have the x and the y-axis labeled, the next step that we should do is label the x and y-axis with numbers, because each of these little lines represents a number. So first of all, on this x-axis, this horizontal axis, right where these two lines intersect, this is 0. And I wrote it a little to the side, but this line is 0. And to label the x-axis, you need to think of it as a number line. To the right of 0 on the number line are positive numbers. So this first line is 1. This second line is positive 2. And then so on. I want you to notice that I'm writing these numbers on the actual lines of the graph, not in between, because this is 7, this is 6. If you think of x as a number line, the numbers to the left of the 0 are negative. So this is -1, -2, and so on. And notice that I'm writing these numbers on the actual line and not in between the lines. Now the y-axis I like to think of as a thermometer. If you saw a thermometer and you knew that this was 0, the numbers above the thermometer are the warmer numbers, the things that are getting warm. The numbers that are below the 0 on the thermometer, those are the colder numbers. These are things getting colder. So we can think of it like that. So here is 0. And just to clarify, you could still have cold temperatures here, but these are the negative temperatures. These are the positive temperatures. So we have the y-axis here. The numbers above the 0 are going to be positive. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and 6. The numbers below the 0 are going to be negative. -1, -2. Notice again that I'm writing these on the lines, not in between the lines. Now, this coordinate plane shows us positive numbers and negative numbers, and it shows us all 4 quadrants, which we'll talk about in a second, and this one will be labeled the same. This is actually kind of a zoomed-in view of this quadrant right here. And the reason we know that is that the place where the 2 axes intersect, if we were to extend these lines, is 0. This is 0 right here. So that means that to the right of the 0 on the x, these are positive numbers. Above the 0 on the y, these are also positive numbers. So let's go ahead and talk about some different other features of the graph besides the x and the y-axis and how we label the graph with numbers. Why are there arrows in the end of these axes? So why are there arrows here and here? We can add some arrows here. Well, that is because these lines or these axes go on forever in every direction. We're going to say the line goes on forever. So for example, this could go up to -1 million. This could go up to a +1 million in the other direction. The lines can go on forever and ever and ever. Our graph can stretch and stretch and stretch. The point where the 2 lines intersect, I actually want you to change this to say where the 2 axes intersect, because that's going to be a little bit more telling. That's called the origin. Now the origin is the spot where the x and the y-axis intersect. Right here. I'm going to draw an arrow. That is the origin. Now if I were to draw a picture of that, we would say that it's right here. And that point right there, and we'll learn about this a little bit later, that point right there is 0, 0. So whenever you see the word origin, you should be thinking 0, 0. So I'm going to go ahead and write that here for you as well, 0, 0. The origin on these other graphs are the same, where the 2 axes intersect, where x intersects with y. So I'm going to write origin. And remember, whenever you think origin, you should think 0, 0. So I'm going to write 0, 0. Oh, and I wrote that in the wrong spot. Hopefully you guys wrote that in the right spot. I'm going to draw an arrow down here. This should go down here. The last thing we want to talk about are something called quadrants. So quadrants are the 4 different regions of the graph. So quadrants. Now something that's a little bit different than we're used to is that when we label quadrants, here's our coordinate plane, we label them with Roman numerals. So I'm going to have you right here, Roman numerals, because that's how we label them. We do not label them with numbers. We label them with Roman numerals. So the first quadrant is here. It is number 1. And we'll learn about points a little bit later, but in this quadrant, x is positive and y is positive. So when we label our points in this quadrant, they will always be positive, positive. Our second quadrant is 2. Now we will have a tendency to want to write our quadrants this way, but they actually go counterclockwise. So I want you to draw a big arrow that moves this that way, so you remember that it's counterclockwise. Our second quadrant is 2. In this quadrant, x is negative and y is positive. So our signs for our points are going to be negative, positive. This is our third quadrant. X is negative, y is negative, so it's going to be negative, negative. And this is our fourth quadrant. And in this quadrant, x is positive and y is negative, so it's positive, negative. So I'm going to go ahead and label that on this graph. We have number 1, quadrant 1, which is positive, positive. We have quadrant 2, which is negative, positive. We have quadrant 3, which is negative, negative. And we have quadrant 4, which is positive, negative. I want you to go ahead and label this graph that we created with the quadrants, including the sign, and also take some time to practice numbering and labeling the origin on this graph, because now at this point we've gone through all the different parts. Okay, there's one more thing that I want to show you, and that is I want to show you this graph. Now remember, we talked about how this was a zoomed in view of here. So just so you have an idea, this is quadrant 1, and our points are positive, positive. And that makes sense, and that's going to help us because we can see that x is positive, we can see that y is positive. When we talk about plotting points, it will help us to identify the quadrant because we'll make sure that the signs in our coordinate pair are correct. Alright, so what I want you to do now is go ahead and do the practice. When you're ready, pause the video, and then when you're ready, press resume, and you can see the answers. Here are the answers. Notice we've labeled the x and the y. We've labeled the origin. We've labeled the axis with numbers, and notice that we have negative and positive numbers on both axes. We've also labeled the quadrants using Roman numerals, and we've written down what the signs of the points in those quadrants would be.